welcome to another episode of Christian Answers. Today we're going to be reviewing again the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings. If you recall, last week we spent some time reviewing that movie, and I was pretty critical of that movie because I felt that the movie producers, directors, writers had changed a lot of the biblical account of Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. It had changed it a lot, rewrote the story, and I was very critical of that. Well, I want to spend a little bit of time. I didn't want to say that everything about that movie was bad, but I do want to point out some of the good and then again some of the bad, and then make an overall evaluation of it. I don't think I give any of the positive, almost no attention to the positive aspects of the movie because there were so many negatives to the movie, and so I wanted to spend some time on the critique rather than actually mentioning some of the good points. Well, there are some good points in the movie, starring Christian Bale and directed by Ridley Scott, the famous Hollywood director. There are some good things in it. One of the good points in it was how Moses was shown to meet his wife, and showed later on during the time that he was in Midian before he went back to Egypt to lead the people out of bondage. It showed him and his family life, and very realistic scenes there. Very realistic how he actually met his wife, and how he actually had a son, and how he trained his son. And there were a lot of realistic, very realistic scenes. I think one of the other very realistic scenes that I can say that I appreciated was the scene that showed Egypt and the Nile River, and it showed aerial shots of what the Pharaoh's palace, and it showed all of the buildings around Pharaoh's headquarters. I think it was Memphis. That was the city. And it showed some really great still shots of what Egypt probably looked like at that time. And I wish I would have, and I will later on, go and stop the DVD at that spot and actually look and spend a little time analyzing that scene, because here is a depiction of what Egypt looked like at the time of Moses, and I think it's pretty accurate. It looked like it was a pretty accurate scene there, where they show the aerial shots of the not only the land of Egypt, but it showed around the Nile, and it showed also where the Israelites camped. Now, if you remember the biblical story, the Jews were camped not in the same area as the Egyptians where they lived. So the Jews were outside of the living area of the Egyptians. In fact, they had their own area where the Jews lived, and they would come to work, and they would come into the cities, and they would come into these pyramid building projects from outside of them. They would actually have their own camps, and the movie showed some realistic sky shots, sky view, bird's eye view of the Jewish camps, which was very realistic. And so I have to say that those were some very good special effects. They were done, no doubt, with computer-aided graphics and all kinds of modern-day technology to make it realistic, and it did really, really make it realistic. So quite a few of the geographical shots and quite a few of the shots of, for example, Egypt and the Jewish camp, a lot of those were very, very positive. And so I would highly recommend looking and reviewing those areas of the movie. If you get a chance to see the movie or get a DVD of the movie, to pause the DVD at those spots and actually look at the detail, because those are worth a lot, just to see how they depicted some of the biblical scenes and biblical times. Also, the land of Midian, when Moses came into the land of Midian after he had crossed the desert, after he had been fleeing Egypt. Those are very realistic scenes too. So you can see the mountain upon which he met God, and the burning bush occurred. Those scenes are really good, and those were done with a lot of care and attention. And one of the things when you watch a movie, you fly by those scenes, and they're only a 1 or 2 second visual field in the movie, but you really should stop the movie if it's a DVD and pause there and watch and look at what was done to create that scene, because it was really, I think, realistic. So I know I'm going to use some of these video clips from the movie, even though I do not highly recommend the movie, even though I think the movie was not an accurate portrayal of the Bible account. There are some really good depictions in the movie that seem to be realistic, more so than I've seen in other movies of the same type. I think of the movie by Cecil B. DeMille's, The Ten Commandments, and that's sort of the standard upon which I think of a Moses movie. But he had more of a Hollywood production backdrop in a lot of his scenes, and he, of course, used thousands and thousands and thousands of extras, of actors, to produce what he did. In the modern version, I believe they use not as many actors and extras, but they use the computer-aided graphics to make the effect of many, many people. And they also do that to make the effects of the geography of the land and the cities. They don't actually build an entire city. They make it all on computer-aided graphics. And so they can actually go into more detail with the computer-aided graphics because they have more to play with. They have more time at the computer. They can make it look more real than even trying to stage the thing and create an entire city from backdrops and sets and things like that. So there are all kinds of positive features of the movie in that respect, even though most of the movie, I have to say, is a disappointment as far as depicting the Bible scenes. Now, there are some other positive things in the movie. Some of the characters are really created that were positive depictions. For example, Moses' sister, Miriam, it shows in the movie that she stayed with the Pharaoh's household and continued to live there. And that is a possibility. It's a possibility that she did stay with Pharaoh's household and live with there, although that's not stated specifically in the Bible that she stayed there long term. But it could have happened, and it showed her, and it showed the Pharaoh's daughter who rescued Moses from the Nile and picked up Moses and made him her son. That was very realistic. And so on and on. There are these little scenes in the movie and some of the people and some of the geography of the movie that are really, really impressive. So it's worth seeing just for those things alone. So I don't want to leave the impression that everything was negative and that I didn't think anything was good in the movie. But overall, the movie was a disappointment, although there were some very, very impressive individual scenes that were good within the movie. Well, don't go away. We're going to be back to part 2, where I talk more about some of the problems with the movie in just a minute. Well, welcome to Christian Answers today for part 2, and I have just talked about some of the positive aspects of the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings, which I got to see again for another time, just to go over it again so I could do a even better job of reviewing it. Now, one of the things that I noticed, and I mentioned last time, was that the Exodus, Gods and Kings movie, the most recent movie, is showing Moses and Ramses Jr. as sort of blood brothers, and they grew up together, and they knew each other, and they were sort of competing against one another, and the Pharaoh Senior actually shows in the movie that he likes Moses and would rather have had Moses rule after him than even his own son Ramses Jr. Well, that, as I pointed out before, is not in the Bible, even though it is something that a lot of the Moses movies, a lot of the Exodus movies show. It's gotten to the point where people are beginning to think that it is in fact a true historical account that Moses and Ramses Jr. were blood brothers, and they played together and they grew up together, and there was this tension between Moses and Ramses Jr. It does not say that in the Bible. It does not say that anywhere in the Bible that these two men grew up together. And so part of the whole story, not only in the older Moses movies, but sometimes, well, definitely in this later Moses movie, what it shows is that Moses and Ramses Jr. were these two brothers. Well, that the most recent Exodus movie shows the same thing, and of course it's not in the Bible, but it helps build the plot, it helps build the tension in the movie, and it does contribute to the general interest of the movie, even though it's not in the Bible. Now, one of the things I pointed out before was that it shows that Moses was exiled from the land of Egypt, and that is not what the Bible says. It says that he was fleeing from Pharaoh. So he actually ran off from Egypt and before he was caught and arrested and possibly killed. So that's a departure from the movie. The biggest departure was the way that he encountered God with a mudslide on the mountain. And of course, the Bible does not say anything about a mudslide. It doesn't show anything about Moses being hit on the head with a boulder. And what the latest Exodus Gods and Kings movie shows is the idea that Moses, in his encounter with God, might not have actually seen or heard anything other than an illusion or delusion in his own mind. It showed him getting hit on the head with a boulder, and then he heard and he saw the vision, and he talked to this person who was supposed to represent God. And then and it reinforced that throughout the movie, because there were parts of the movie that would show Moses talking to this God representative figure, this little boy, as they showed in the movie, representing God, which was another vast departure from the Bible. But it showed him talking to this God kind of figure, but when Joshua would look and watch Moses talking, he would only see Moses. So he didn't see the little boy representing God. So throughout the movie, we're left with this impression that perhaps the entire revelation from God to Moses was just in the head of Moses, just in his mind, and that he was hearing voices and he was seeing visions as a result of being hit on the head with a rock slide when he was in Midian. And so we are left with that impression. Well, of course, that's a totally modern-day impression. It has nothing to do with the Bible. The Bible specifically says that God revealed to Moses this vision for going back to Egypt and freeing the slaves. There was nothing at all in the Bible that would indicate that Moses was seeing a vision or was being delusional. There's nothing at all about that. So this was, again, a modern day addition to the biblical account, and it makes the movie weaker for it, I believe, because whenever you start changing the script, the historical script, then you begin to get into dangerous waters. You begin to get into dangerous territory, because you're trying to make the biblical account more interesting or to more compelling, and you're trying to insert your own ideas in it, and that is not good, because the Bible, of course, is a historical account of what happened. It actually is not just history, it's holy history. It's what happened between God and the people that he was trying to lead. And so when you change the story, when you change the history, you are literally changing the history. You're rewriting history. You're not just changing a story, you're rewriting history, and that is not acceptable. We need to not encourage that. And we've seen a number of Hollywood movies that have departed like that. For example, the movie Noah, and we'll see that. I'm going to review that movie in the future, possibly next week. But we saw a huge rewrite of the whole Noah and the Ark account. And supposedly, I guess the writers felt that they came up with a better story, a more compelling account of what is in the Bible. They felt that they could do a better job. You see, what is at root? What is the core thinking of the writers and the secular producers and directors today is that they are simply making a better story than the writers of the Bible. See, they don't believe, many of them don't believe in the actual biblical account of history. They see, for example, Noah and the flood as a story, as a creation, as a fiction. They view it that way, even though the Bible presents it as historical fact, and as Christians we believe it's historical fact. These writers see it as just another story that someone created or some community created, and they look at it and say, we can do better. We can make it more compelling, we can make it more interesting, we can make it more powerful, and we can give it a even different meaning. And so they attempt to do the rewrite, and they do the rewrite, but it usually fails and falls flat on its face, because when you start trying to change the actual historical account, things fall apart. And that's what we saw in the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings. When you start trying to change things, you actually make it worse. You do not improve the plot. You do not improve the account. It becomes less inspiring and it becomes less compelling when humans try to manipulate and rewrite history. And that's what was done with Noah, the flood movie that I will be reviewing in a few weeks, and even in the latest Exodus movie. That's what happened with the movie by Ridley Scott. It made it less compelling, less important, and so we need to just say and encourage writers and Hollywood producers and actors, we need to encourage them to stick to the Bible. Don't depart. Don't try to get creative in the sense of changing the whole story or changing the plot or trying to rewrite things. Don't do that. Do the best you can with the story as it is, because it's history. And it's important to create historical movies when you're covering the Bible, because if you're not going to follow the history of the Bible, then you should not even call it anything related to the Bible. You need to call it by a totally different name and go ahead and create something totally different if you're going to do that. But if you're going to do a Bible movie, you need to stick to the Bible, and as the audience and as the moviegoers, we need to ask that Hollywood stick to the Bible and not try to depart from it, because when they do, things fall apart. Well, I'll be back here for part 3 in just a moment. Stick with me. Well, welcome to part 3 of Christian Answers today, and we're talking about the movie Moses, Gods and Kings, and we're looking at different positive and negative aspects of the movie. The positive ones I pointed out in the first segment were some of the depictions of the scenes that were really well done, and some of the characters in the movie were well done. I think, for example, you had an older elder of the Jews, played by Ben Kingsley, the famous actor, and he did a really good job in showing Moses and explaining to Moses who Moses really was and who his parents were and how he came to be in Pharaoh's court and who his identity is. And that was a really good scene, because that is something that really could have happened. There could have been an individual, or there could have been elders in the Jewish community that explained to Moses who he really is and not who he thought he was. He thought he was Pharaoh's son. He thought he was an Egyptian, and as it turned out, he was a Jew, and the Jewish elder in this movie explained to him who he was, even though he rejected that and he didn't believe it at first. It does show that he did, inside of him at somewhere level, he did believe that he had heard the truth. So that was a good scene. One of the scenes that was not so good was his brother Aaron, it shows in this movie, did not come out to meet him in the wilderness as he was coming back into Egypt to begin to deliver the Jews. Now in the Bible it says that Aaron walked out into the wilderness and met Moses and brought him in. And in the movie here it showed that Aaron stayed in the Jewish camp and Moses actually came and sought him out and sought his family out. So there are great differences between the biblical account and this movie. And I think there is really no rule or system as to when and where the Bible is going to be departed from, and the producers, directors, writers in this movie take over and do their own thing. There are some scenes in this movie that, quite frankly, are unbelievable. They don't. One of the big scenes that struck me at first that was totally unrealistic, and I think I mentioned it last week, is when the crocodiles were sent to eat the Egyptian men who were in the boats on the Nile River, and it showed these gigantic wild crocodiles tearing into the fishermen out there on the Nile River, and that was supposedly the cause of the red color on the Nile River. So the reason that the Nile River turned blood red was because of all of the men who had been eaten by the crocodiles. It was their blood, and that was so unrealistic. I don't know anybody that I've talked to that thought that that was even remotely possible, that you could make the Nile run red because of all the dead bodies that the crocodiles had eaten. Simply unbelievable, unreliable. Another thing was, I mentioned before, that at the end, and this is the spoiler alert, so don't be upset, but Moses and Ramses Jr. Get crushed by a huge 100-foot wave right out in the middle of the Red Sea. This wave, they look up and they see this huge wave crashing in on them, and then a few minutes later it shows both of them alive standing on the shore in their respected sides of the Red Sea. Now, totally unbelievable, totally unfathomable how that could happen. I mean, if you have a 100-foot wave crash upon you, tons of water, you are not going to come out of the Nile. The Red Sea alive. You're going to stay down there dead like Pharaoh's army was. And yet, the movie shows Moses coming out of the Red Sea on the beach there, and then it shows Ramses Jr. doing the same thing. It's just unbelievable, and nobody would believe that it could happen. And I don't even know why it was put in the movie like that, because I always thought that you had to try to create a realistic scenario for whatever you're doing. And especially if you're not going to follow the Bible, I would have thought that the directors, producers, and writers would have tried to make whatever happened in the movie plausible, and using, the laws of science and laws of nature, if that's what they were going to try to do to make this account more believable. I would have thought they would have tried harder to make it more believable, because the way they actually changed things, the way they actually showed things with this 100-foot wall of water hitting Moses and Pharaoh Ramses Jr., it actually made it unbelievable. So I think what happened was, in trying to change the story of the waters parting and the Red Sea parting and the Egyptian army being drowned and the Israelites being rescued, in trying to change it and make it more plausible, they actually changed it and made it more unbelievable, because it didn't even seem like it would even make sense that Moses would live and Pharaoh Jr. would live in the way the movie was done. So it shows you the dangers and what happens when you try to make or remake a movie or an account in the Bible. And no doubt these producers, writers, directors, actors were trying to do something beyond what Cecil B. DeMille did 50, 60 years ago. They're trying to move beyond that and make it more modern, make it more up-to-date, make it more plausible. But ironically, in trying to do that, in trying to update Moses and the Exodus, in trying to make it more plausible, they actually made it more unbelievable. Some of the other scenes were unbelievable too. The Exodus Gods and Kings tries to make Moses out to be a guerrilla fighter. He arms the Jews. He teaches them weaponry. So the long and the short of this movie, and this is the last review that I will give of Exodus Gods and Kings, is that in attempting to make the story more believable, the writers and directors and producers of this movie actually make it less believable. And so I think that should be a good lesson to all in Hollywood. When you're doing a biblical story, do a biblical story. Do not alter, do not change, do not create new characters, do not try to make the story better, because in the process you're only going to make it worse. It's not going to fit. It's going to be less credible than if you simply try to be faithful to what the Bible says and simply present history as history. Don't try to rewrite history. And I would recommend that anyone go see this movie, but I would also recommend that you review it and reflect on it in a critical manner, because that's what it really invites us to do because of all the changes that were made in the script. So I hope that that's been helpful to you. I hope you get to see this movie, and I hope to see you back here next week on another episode of Christian Answers. God bless.